so much. I'm just going to switch over to the handheld mic so I can wander. Can you all hear me okay? Perfect. Thumbs up in the back? Perfect. Thank you so much. So I just got here, so I haven't been part of the provocative conversation yet. But my hope is that by the end of this, that there will be even more provocative conversation, and I urge you to ask any burning questions you have on your mind, whether it's in front of the room in the question session afterwards, or if you find me alone afterwards and you don't want to ask it in front of the room. So you've heard a little bit about me. I want you to start by memorizing this picture, and there's a lot going on in it, and we'll get back to it in a little bit. But just to orient you, that big orange blob, there's a shoe sticking up in the air, and there's someone in a spacesuit, and that someone is me, standing up sitting, lying, flopping inelegantly in an emergency raft. And just think about that for a second. We'll get to it. So you've heard about me. My name is Dr. Shawna Pandya. I am here to talk to you today about success, resilience, failure, and pushing the limits. But the full title of my talk is Success, Failure, Resilience, Pushing the Limits, What I've Learned from Skydiving, Piloting, Space Surgery, Martial Arts, and my dad. But that usually tends to be too long to put in the program book, so that's why we have the truncated version. So my life, I've had a really good run. I've had one series of fortunate adventures after the other. In my time here, I've been, at one point, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. I've been a model. I've been currently a citizen scientist astronaut candidate. I'm currently finishing my training in something called enhanced surgical skills, and I've been a competitive martial artist. But it doesn't come overnight, and along the way I've learned a lot of lessons about what it takes to be a success and what it takes to pick yourself up after a failure, and how we build resilience and what that even means, and how we push our limits, and what it means to test our mettle and build character. And I have this favorite quote by a Canadian astronaut, Chris Hadfield, and in his book, An Astronaut's Guide to Earth, he says, "I wasn't born to become an astronaut. I wasn't destined to become an astronaut. I had to turn myself into one." And when you work hard towards a goal, you learn a lot of lessons along the way. And my hope is when you leave this room, you have lots of ideas. You're burning with inspiration and passion and empowerment for what it is you do in your own life. And there may be so many themes that we cover here today that you might be struggling to remember them afterwards. And if that happens, I want you to come back to one simple, 2-syllable, easy to remember, super unsexy word, and that word is nuance. Because everything we talk about here today, whether it's success, failure, resilience, character, pushing the limits, communication, team building, I want you to come away with the sense that none of this is an either-or phenomenon. It's not a one-time thing that happens or not. It's not a label that sticks with you for life. But all of this is part of a continuum or a journey. It's part of a spectrum. And once you have one label, it doesn't mean you're stuck with it forever. So let's talk a little bit about success. So this here is our hero shot from our parabolic flight testing at the National Resource Council in Ottawa. And every year we go to Ottawa, and in fact I'm heading there in 2 weeks to do what we call parabolic flight or zero gravity testing of a commercial spacesuit. And so it's called parabolic flight because your flight path goes up and down in parabolas, and that gives you simulated artificial gravity. And what you can see here in this hero shot is we all look great, we're backlit, we have the perfect lighting, but success isn't like that. Anyone who has gotten to any position of empowerment or has achieved something knows that the graph towards success looks a little bit more like that. And sometimes it feels like you're Sisyphus climbing up that hill, pushing up that boulder, taking 2 steps forward and sliding 1 step back. And the key lesson is you just have to keep going. And so I told you to memorize that photo before because I want to prove to you that maybe that success isn't always a straightforward path. And I would posit to you, if you're always winning, maybe you're in the wrong league. Maybe you're NHL material playing in the beer leagues. And maybe it's time to challenge yourself a little bit. So coming back to that first picture that we saw, so here's the backstory to that. So earlier this year, we were testing spacesuits again in something we called emergency spacecraft egress. So this was at Groton, Connecticut at Survival Systems USA. And the scenario was this. Your spacecraft has crash landed. You've had to eject. You're coming down on your parachute. And now in this scenario, you're landing into water, ostensibly an ocean. You have to unhook yourself from the parachute harness, deflate your portable inflation devices, and then crack the seals on your spacesuit so no water comes in, swim to the raft, climb to the raft, and then you're home free. Simple, right? So everything in my scenario was going perfectly, was going great, until I tried to pull the seals, and they did not work. And all of a sudden, I was here at the raft, and my bulky spacesuit was already taking on a lot of water. And so here I was on the flimsy ropes on the end of this raft trying to climb up, already trying to pull up the weight of myself and the spacesuit. And if you look at these, they're not impressive. There's not a lot of upper body strength there. And now you consider that I'm chest deep in water, so I'm pulling up to 75% more of my weight. And it was a struggle. And it was this epic battle between gravity and working millimeter by millimeter at a time. And eventually, in the unprettiest of ways, I was a success. And there was something very deliberate about the way that I fell. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But through diligence and perseverance and stick-to-itiveness and fortitude, through resilience, I was able to get through this scenario, which was meant to be 2 minutes, which was not meant to take on water in the spacesuit, which is why we have simulations. I got through it in 10 inglorious minutes, flopping like a giant goldfish, hopping into an emergency raft. But it was resilience that got me through that scenario. And when we look at success, it's not an either-or phenomenon. It is a spectrum. And success and resilience is equally important, whether we're talking about success and what we're going to talk about a little bit later, that is failure. Resilience isn't something that we're born with. Resilience is the ability to keep going when times are tough and keep succeeding when we're winning, and it's the ability to bounce back when we failed. And it can actually be broken down to 5 key components. It's something that can be cultivated. It's something that we can practice in our daily lives to make ourselves more resilient. So when we reach the next tough scenario, whether it's for good or for bad, we can practice even more resilience. And so resilience comes down to breaking things down, positive self-talk, mental rehearsal, impulse control, and having positive social supports. And so coming back to the spacecraft scenario, every single one of these factors came into play that day because if you were there at that moment, you could hear my teammates. They were all crowded around. They were all watching that horribly inglorious, ungraceful moment, but they were there with me. And one of my teammates, if you could hear the video from the time, he was saying, the astronaut is right there. The astronaut was right there. And what he meant by that is he had been part of the top 2% in the recent Canadian astronaut selection. And he was saying that, just hang in there, because he knew what I knew, and he knew what I was mentally rehearsing, was that if this was the Canadian astronaut selection, it was up to me to decide whether to hang in there and to keep going, or to decide to fail, or to decide to give up. And if I did give up, I was choosing to take myself out of the running to be an astronaut. And then the other part of mental rehearsal was imagining myself in the real life scenario of which this simulation was actually designed for. If I actually had crash landed in the ocean, there was a really strong impulse to give up. I was at the point of mechanical failure. My fingers were barely holding on to that rope and the raft. And the only thing was that self-talk saying that you gotta hang on, because in my mind, if this was in the ocean and I let go for real, I was dead. And it was the last part of that, the last part of the resilience was breaking things down. It was a 10-minute struggle for what should have been 2 minutes without water. It was millimeter by millimeter. It was looking at the end goal. And it was keeping on going, climbing up that rope ladder on the raft until I managed to flop over. So the other lessons I've learned about success come to me from martial arts. And for any brand new white belt, regardless of their age, whether they're 5 or they're 50, comes through the dojang to our Taekwondo studio, they're imbued with the same 5 fundamental tenets of Taekwondo. And those are courtesy, integrity, self-control, and of course, perseverance and indomitable spirit. And it's perfectly summed up in a sign on our club that says, fall down 7 times, rise up 8. And so that's the key with success. If you think back to that graph, when you deal with a setback, the reason that people who end up being successful isn't because they're lucky. It's not because they've become an overnight success. It's because they've kept on going for every time there's a setback. And it's because they talked themselves out of a rut every time they failed. And it's because they chose to keep on going. So one of the other lessons I learned about stick-to-itiveness and indomitable spirit actually came when I was fighting for real. This is from my first amateur fight in Muay Thai in Thailand. And so for the past 3 years, since 2015, I've been going to fight camps in Thailand to partake in Muay Thai. And in my last year there, in 2017, there was the first opportunity to fight in an amateur fight. And in retrospect, when I look at the data and the statistics around that fight, it probably wasn't the best fight to pick because I was flying off back to Canada the next day to start my clinical practice. So there was a very real chance for concussion, and my opponent was this really good German girl who was 35 pounds heavier with a background in MMA and boxing, but she was the only one there, so I said, she's here, I'm here, why not? And that's actually how I end up doing a lot of the things I do in life. And so this fight I remember really well because it was another lesson in resilience and just getting through to the end, because I had watched her in class. I'd watched her meticulously. I dissected her technique, and she was quite good. But sometimes, in addition to talent and hard work, it comes down to who wants it more that night. And for me, it was me who wanted it more that night, because it was 10 p.m. on a Saturday. Neither of us had eaten all day, just in fear of the anxiety, or in anticipation of the anxiety around the fight. And I just knew that I wanted to do the best I could and walk out of that ring in a respectable fashion. And they had promised us, okay, no matter what happens, three rounds, and whatever happens, happens. If it's a tie, it's a tie, and you guys both get consolation prizes. And so I fought my heart out with one contact lens in from the first 5 seconds onwards. Depth perception is important, I learned. And at the end of the 3rd round, they said, it's a tie. And then the audience started chanting, one more round. And she looks at me and I look at her, and we know we can both barely lift a limb to even throw a punch or a kick, but it's what we want to do. And so it just came down to hanging in there and giving up, or holding back on that urge to give up, controlling that impulse, and just bouncing back. And trust me, I had fallen down more than once that fight, and I definitely got up more than once. Sometimes when it comes to success, you just have to hang in there, even if it's not pretty. The other key I've learned about success is playing the what-if game. So for those of you who are fans of Tony Robbins, he calls it anticipatory thinking. He says that winners anticipate, losers react. And for those of you who are friends of Chris Hadfield, in his book, he calls it the power of negative thinking. And he says, you have to imagine the worst case scenario. Or if you're my brother, he says, trust in God, but lock your doors. Which is true. And so coming back to that first slide in which you saw me inelegantly splayed on a raft with my feet up in the air, there was a very deliberate reason for that, because I was playing the what-if game. I was looking at the worst-case scenario, because in addition to all the other goals in that scenario, including getting up into the raft, I could see as I finally peeked my head over the edge of the raft that the raft was full of ankle-deep in water. And the temptation to slide over into the raft and then just rest was great. But my fear was that if I just slammed face first into the raft, I didn't have enough leverage in my spacesuit. It was kind of like a turtle. I wouldn't be able to move over, and my teammates would just think I was resting, and I would ironically, heroically, tragically die splayed, ankle deep, face first in water. And so that's what motivated that action. It was playing the what if game. What if X happens? And it's the same in piloting, it's the same in surgery, it's the same in martial arts. What if I come in too fast and too steep on this landing? Do I go around? Do I go again? What if I have an engine failure? What if I'm doing a particularly difficult delivery? Will I need an instrument? What if the shoulders get stuck? How am I going to react? Playing that anticipation game, playing the what if game prepares us and sets us up to succeed, because now we're looking at all possibilities. The other tactic I use when I'm trying to succeed, when I'm trying to attain my goals, is maintaining what I call a rate of scan. So when you're flying a plane, you maintain a rate of scan. You're looking outside at the train, you're looking at your instrument panels, you're looking at the map. When you're jumping out of a plane, you're looking at your altimeter, you're looking at the ground around you, you're maintaining that rate of scan between the two. It's the same as when you're driving a car. You are looking outside, you're looking at your rearview mirror, you're looking at your dashboard, and you're scanning constantly between the three. And the reason you're doing that is to answer one simple question, and that is, where am I right now in relation to where I want to be, and what is my progress? And so we keep that in mind when we're looking at setting goals and we're trying to be successful, because we want to know, what is our end game? Where are we in relation to that end game? And are we making the progress we want towards that goal? So in the case of the raft, it was painful, millimeter by millimeter progress towards the end goal of getting into the raft, but I was getting there. When I set goals, I do the same thing. I maintain a rate of scan. I set long-term goals, medium-term goals, short-term goals, and immediate-term goals. And then I look at, where am I in relation to where I want to be in 10 years? What needs to be done today? What needs to be done this week? And how is that going to help me in the long game? And so that's how I use the rate of scan to help me get to where I want to be. But what you've probably noticed is that success and failure can be two sides of the same coin, and a lot of what we've talked about today can equally apply to failure. So I want to tell you about a different scenario. So this picture is from November, different parabolic flight campaign last year in Florida, and this was something I was really excited about. We were going to test a brand new, sleek, new blue spacesuit, so not the goldfish orange suit that you saw before. We were testing in a new location. We were testing in Florida. We were doing it with a new company, a new aircraft. And what was really exciting and really humbling about this particular mission was that there were so many new variables between the spacesuit, the location, the mission, that we wanted everything to go right. So Project Possum, the citizen scientist astronaut corps that this was under, looked at their most experienced flyers and looked at who had the best track record performing well in previous zero-G flights, and then asked those of us who'd done this a lot to be the suited test subjects. So it was a bit of an honor as well. And on a more personal note, this was going to be my 100th parabola. So it was really exciting. And just working with the team I'd worked with time and time again, it was, it was something I was looking so forward to. But sometimes where you picture your trajectory going versus what actually happens tend to be two different things. And this has never happened to me before, but sometimes the mental resilience doesn't agree with what the digestive tract's resilience says. And I ended up throwing up early on in the flight. And not only is it super gross to throw up in zero gravity with your helmet down, just think about that for a sec. It's also dangerous because your helmet's down and there's a real risk of asphyxiation. So we had to abort my flight early. And it was devastating because you're there to be part of a team to help test the spacesuit, to help gather data. And I was the failure point. And as my teammates like to say, you had one job. All I had to do was test that spacesuit. And so what I've learned is, despite our best efforts, despite our best attempts at being resilient, we're going to fail in life. But a failure isn't final as long as we dissect that failure, that sequence of events of both external and internal, and what led us there in the first place, and analyze that sequence of events and see how we might change our own reactions in the future, so as not to repeat that sequence of actions. So coming back to looking at success and failure as sides of the same coin, I want to talk now about tools that have helped me deal with times of failure, because sometimes we're going to fail hard. And that can be true of anything, whether we're talking about our professional lives, our careers, our goals, our personal lives, heartbreak, marriage, relationships. And so one of the most important tools I've learned is that of reframing. And we can all look at the same situation, we can see different things. And sometimes it's a matter of shifting our perspective to view that specific situation with a different filter. And so we can look at a situation, we can say, is this a 6 or is it a 9? And I'll give you some examples. So a couple weeks ago, I was talking with one of my colleagues about his night on call, and I walked into the residence room that day and I took a picture of it because I was like, well, he clearly didn't sleep. So when you're on call, if you have a good night, you get to go home and you sleep in your own bed. And if it's a busier night, you get to maybe see the hospital call room. And if it's a particularly busy night, you either don't sleep at all, or in the case of my colleague, he caught a few Z's on the residence room couch. And I was saying that to him, I was like, oh man, you didn't get any, I saw the sheets on the couch, and I was like, oh, poor guy. And saying, man, you must be exhausted. And he's like, oh yeah, I got to get back to the couch a few times and catch a few power naps here and there. Isn't that great? And I was like, what a mind shift. Because in my mind, I was thinking, oh my God, poor guy, he barely got any sleep. And he's like, oh my God, in my mind, my night was insane. I was lucky enough to get a few minutes of sleep. And to give you another example of how powerful reframing can be, I want to tell you about my dad. Because my dad is a Jedi master when it comes to reframing. He can pull a silver lining out of the worst of situations. And I will give you a concrete example that still blows my mind to this day. So we live in Sherwood Park, my parents do, and we were going to Edmonton. And we were going from Sherwood Park Freeway, taking the construction zone on Sherwood Park Freeway, to the construction zone downtown, taking the construction zone on the way there. And anyone who lives here in Edmonton knows that it's one big construction zone. I was like, why are we even here? Like, why did we not just stay home? It's all one big construction zone. And my dad, because he's this eternal optimist, he's like, isn't this great? We have the economy to invest in our infrastructure and make things better. And my dad managed, in my mind, in that moment, to make me grateful for construction zones. Not a thing I thought I would ever do. But the point is, no matter what the situation is, if you learn to shift your focus, you can find the valuable or the good in it, and you can learn to reframe. And where that comes into relation in times of failure is, you can be hard on yourself in a way that's productive, or you can be hard on yourself in a way that's destructive. And you can ask, why me, why here, why now? Or you can say, what led to this? And what did I learn from this? And how do I make it better next time? The other thing that I've learned about in times of failure is the value of the art of the debrief. And so this is equally important in times of failure and times of success. And regardless of what aspect of my life I've been part of, whether it's martial arts or surgery or piloting or space, I found debriefing to be extremely valuable. So in surgery, we're constantly evaluated on our technical skills to the point where we have to sit down with a surgeon afterwards and review what happened and be evaluated and kind of be dissected. And when things go right, it's really important because you want to reinforce what went right and keep those skills in mind for the next surgery and keep practicing at a high level. And when things went wrong, you want to dissect it piece by piece, layer by layer, to know where things went wrong. And it's extremely valuable because one of the surgeons that I work with, she has a very interesting way of doing this. She makes her learners fill out the evaluation on how they think they did before meeting with her, and then she looks at how they self-evaluated and gives her evaluation. And then you can see what the correlation or the mismatch is between how we think we performed. And it's so valuable because already as you're operating the next time, you know to have that self-critical, self-reflective, self-auditing mindset. And so even as you're operating, you think, okay, well, I did that wrong, well, I did that right. And you're already thinking about your performance and how to make it better. And it's true in skydiving too. When I was going for my accelerated free fall solo skydiving license, after every single jump, we would sit down with the instructor and one-on-one, he would say, or she would say, give me your version of events. And then I would say, I did this, this, and this, and I did this, this, and this. And then the instructor would say, okay, but did you think about when you did this or the timing of how you did this? And the value is when you're learning to think critically about yourself and you have the opportunity to sit down with someone who has more experience or more insight, you actually get insight into where your own blind spots lie. It's gotten to the point where in martial arts now I actually film my fights and I review them afterwards, because what I've learned about success and failure and winning and losing is it's not an either-or phenomenon. It's a spectrum. And sometimes when I look at fights where I've lost, where I thought I've been thoroughly trounced, it's been a lot closer than I've thought. And when I look at victories where I thought, man, I just smashed my opponent, got the gold, no problem, it was actually a hair-splitting decision. So that's why I think the art of debriefing with ourselves, at the very least, when we fail and figuring out where we went wrong, and if we have the opportunity to debrief with someone who has more experience, is even better, because it gives us tools for knowing exactly how we went wrong, where we went wrong, and then making a plan in the future to not repeat that sequence of events or to reinforce good behaviors. So, coming back, after all of these lessons learned, coming back to that flight in Florida where I failed last year, I started to think about my own performance. And I managed to reframe, because we didn't get all the data we wanted, but we actually managed to get some data from that flight. And more importantly, it's not the last time I'll be flying zero-G by any stretch of the imagination. So it got me thinking of, what can I do to mitigate that? How can I prevent that from happening again? Because A, it's gross, and B, we have work to do here. So I'd have definite plans for how I'm going to tackle going to Ottawa in a couple of weeks and continuing on with some spacesuit testing. So what I've learned from failure is that the pain of failure can be a beautiful teacher. And I liken it to physical pain. So why do we have nerve endings? Why do we even feel pain? And if you think of a scenario in which we touch a hot stove, and it hurts in the moment, but we know the next time to not touch that stove again. And it's the same with the pain of failure. It's the same with emotional pain. Because when we feel pain from hard knocks, from the school of hard knocks, those lessons stick with us. And we remember not to repeat that sequence of events that landed us there in the first place. And one of the biggest things that my dad taught me is that, and he usually said this to me when I was a kid, my older brother was not being very nice to me, but he would say that you may not be able to control your own circumstances or the actions of others, but you can 100% always control your own thoughts and actions. And that gives you power over any situation, that gives you power over your successes and your failures, and that gives you room to own that situation. And now I want to talk about the really tough stuff, because we've kind of been talking about failure at a high level, but I know every single one of us in this room has been at more rock bottom, tough, downtrodden times. There have been, I'm sure all of us have had our moments where we're binge watching TV, eating Ben & Jerry's, and in our sweatpants, or in the 2018 fashion, wearing yoga pants, binge watching Netflix, and eating Greek yogurt, because that's the healthy thing to do. And you can do that. But sometimes it's a small step, and it's a hard step, but it's a simple step. And it's just to ask for help. And that's equally true for when you're at rock bottom and you feel that you have nowhere to go, or even if you're struggling a little bit with a project or work that you've done a million times before. And you'd be surprised at how simple sometimes solutions present themselves. So to give you an example, my schedule can sometimes be insane to the point where I'm coming back into town at 3 a.m., driving an hour and a half back to the hospital, maybe catching 30 minutes of sleep, and then starting a 30-hour call shift, which is hard and not ideal. And so with my current schedule, I'm doing 3 cities over 10 days, and I was initially planning to do a speaking engagement and then fly back to work and then do 1 day here, fly to a different city, 2 days here, fly back and then do that and just keep juggling things. And then I mentioned this to my program director and he looked at me and said, "That's insane. Why don't you just push your next rotation off by 10 days? And I said, "Okay, we'll try your way." But the answer is, like, sometimes when you make things really complicated and you decide to ask for help, sometimes there's an easier solution, and it's as simple as asking. And sometimes it's just a matter of checking that ego and swallowing that pride, but you'd be surprised at the results. And part of learning to deal with the tough stuff is akin to reframing, and that's looking for the silver lining in every situation. Because I guarantee you that no matter what you're going through, there is always something to be grateful for. And the way I know that is if you are able to complain, then you are still breathing. And if you're still breathing, you're alive. And if you're alive, you have the ability to be grateful. And so I want to tell you about this scenario I went to with my parents. And they dragged me to this introductory level yoga class. And I'm kind of a high-strung, high-energy, impatient person. And so they took me to this yoga class. And the first exercise we did was wiggling our toes. And I'm sure some of you are doing that right now just to kind of prove to yourselves how easy it is. And for 5 minutes, this is all we were doing. We're wiggling our toes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it was mind-numbing, and I was just about to lose my mind, and I was like, this cannot be a thing. And as I was thinking this, I flashed back to one of my first weeks in surgical training, and I was in the neurosurgical unit in the ICU, and we had a patient roll in, and he was young. He had done all the right things. He had worn his full personal protective gear. The accident was no fault of his own, but he had been the wrong person, the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was now a high-level quadriplegic with a wife at home and a baby on the way. And suddenly, it was the best feeling in the world just to be able to wiggle my toes. And so sometimes, no matter what the situation is, you have to look for the silver lining. Because if you're alive, you have the ability to be grateful, and you have the ability to try again. So resilience is equally important in times of failure and times of success. And we can't talk about fear without talking about failure, or failure without talking about fear. Because just as we're convinced in society that if you're success once, you're success forever, if you're a failure once, you're a failure forever, we have this mythos or this idea that if you are afraid of something once, you're afraid of something forever. And oftentimes I get asked, what am I afraid of? And that answer used to be, well, not much. I'm not afraid of anything, really. And then I went for my solo skydiving license, and I'm not afraid of heights. And I went up in the plane, and then I got to the door, and I was about to jump out, and I realized I'm not afraid of heights. I'm afraid of jumping from heights. And that's an interesting realization to come through at 14,000 feet in the air. And you go through this certain crise d'existence when you're in that position. And I looked around the plane, and I realized there were 2 options I could take. I could take the ride of shame and come down in the plane, or I could try and jump. And it wasn't this magical Disney moment where I jumped and I was living happily ever after. It took repeated exposure and rationalization and extinction and working my way through that fear over multiple jumps. And so for the first step through rationalization was looking around the plane and seeing the sea of happy, smiling faces who jumped before, and spoiler alert, they came back, they survived. But on the subsequent jumps, my pulse would still skyrocket. And things didn't go right every single time. On my second jump, I was still on the radio, and my instructor was supposed to teach me how to land, and then the battery died, and so I had to learn how to land on my own on my second jump. So that was not ideal. And then on my third jump, I didn't have my body position quite right. And so I became asymmetrical and I spun out of control at 200 kilometers per hour, which is less fun than it sounds. And I actually hyperextended my shoulder, and suddenly I couldn't lift it and I couldn't really quite steer the canopy. And then learning to land like that was a challenge. So overcoming fear is just like trying to be successful or trying to work your way up from a failure. It's not a straightforward path. But the bottom line is that fear goes away, but it takes work. Failure can be overcome, but it takes work. So why do we push the limits? I liken it to materials stress testing. So when we stress materials, why do we do that? We do it to find the breaking point. And the reason we find the breaking point is A, so we know not to go that far again, or so we can choose to reinforce our materials, so we know that we can go further next time. And I think that character is like that too. We push our limits and we put ourselves in challenging and tough situations so that we can reinforce our own character, or we can decide that was enough for me and I'm not going to go that far again. So this is a picture of the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah. I did a 2-week tour there, real life on fake Mars, earlier this spring with 5 other people. So we were a citizen scientist astronaut crew, diverse, three nations, backgrounds, including engineers, computer scientists, physicians, mixed gender. And as you can imagine, living in close quarters with 5 other grown adults for 2 weeks is a different way of pushing the limits. And to give you an idea of what it's like, if you want to go outside, you are living on fake Mars. So if you want to go outside, you have to don a spacesuit. If you want fresh air, well, sorry, you're out of luck. And if you want to eat anything other than freeze-dried broccoli, well, also, you're out of luck. And also, it's horrible, and I never want to see broccoli again. And it really challenges your limits from a psychological perspective. Because you're in close quarters and you're in constraints. And to give you an example, once when I was younger, I got to see Canadian astronaut Roberta Bondar speak. And she told us how in her time in space, for gross factor reasons, she forbade her teammates from flossing in space because, as you can imagine, that would get quite gross. And I never thought of that moment until I was back in confined quarters on Mars. And I was sitting in the common room one day, and all of a sudden, one of my teammates starts scratching really loudly. And then comes the spray of skin flakes. And I'm just on the edge of this flash zone. I was like, okay, I can handle it. Be resilient. Be good. This is testing limits, but we're good. And then my teammate on my right starts doing the same thing. And it's suddenly a sea of spraying skin flakes. And I was like, okay, this is the limit. What do we do? And you can't very well go outside. But one of the lessons I've learned about psychology in manned spaceflight is there's 2 ways to respond to situations, and one's more successful than the other. And we can respond to situations with emotionally oriented responses and say, ew, gross, oh my God, please don't do that again, or with action-oriented responses. And in this case, I just removed myself from the stimulus. I think I found that a really interesting way to deal with conflict and when our limits are being tested. Pursue an action-oriented response. It ends better. So, how do we decide to push our limits? Like when we decide that we're testing our limits, what questions do we ask ourselves? And you've heard me allude to this throughout this talk. By virtue of my profession, I like to say we need to be surgical about it. We need to dissect through the layers and be objective and be clinical and analyze our actions. And the same is true for pushing the limits. We need to be clinical about it. We need to ask ourselves, when we think we've reached the limit, is this really it? And can I go further next time? Or do I even want to? And if I want to, how do I do that? And sometimes it comes back to exactly what we talked about, breaking things down. So The landscapes on fake Mars were beautiful in Utah, were amazing. And even though we had our spacesuits on all the time, we would go on some things we called EVAs, or extravehicular activities. And they could be quite physically demanding because it could get up to 30 degrees Celsius. We would be in these really hot, confined, stifling spacesuits with heavy backpacks on our shoulders, and we would cover 11 kilometers at a time. And sometimes it just came down to continuing on with the mission objectives and just breaking things down to left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. And sometimes it's as simple as that. So how do we manage the risk that comes with pushing the limits? And I actually like the way that NASA does it. So the NASA has a very well-documented risk matrix. And when they're looking at taking on risk, they look at what is the likelihood of this risk occurring versus what is the severity of this risk happening. And so if something is very low likelihood and low consequence, they don't really worry about it. Maybe they'll monitor the situation. Versus if something is very likely and of severe consequence that is mission ending, that's a no-go situation. They have to take steps to intervene. And I think it's a good way of managing risk in our own lives. And in fact, I really like this matrix so much that I've appropriated it for dealing with priorities. So this is how I decide to make my own priorities. I look at my own personal values and see how important something is to me. And then I look at the timeliness in which it needs to be achieved or that I want to achieve it. And it's important because often I get asked, how do you do so much? How do you study Russian and Spanish and do martial arts and surgery and skydive and scuba dive and everything else you do? And the answer is, relax. I'm not doing it all in the same 24 hours. And I like to say there's a season for everything. So if you think of a star high school athlete who's on the baseball, soccer, badminton, volleyball, basketball teams, they're busy, but they're not playing all of those sports at the same time. There is a season for everything. So when we're deciding to take on new challenges and push the risks, and push the boundaries and push the limits, you don't need to do it all at once. There is a time and a place, and there's a way to take on that risk safely, and there's a way to prioritize that in a way that fits in with all of your other life goals. So one of the last things I want to talk to you about today, how do we even decide to start? Because sometimes we just have so much information coming at us from all directions, and sometimes there's just so much to wade through in life, and there's so much going on that I like to boil it down to a simple question. Go or no go. And this is true in the most high intensity and the most low intensity of situations. And I'll give you an example. I was on call for obstetrics one night, and there was a patient that I was really worried about. She had a high-risk infant, and she was currently doing well. The fetal heart rate was within normal limits, so I decided to let her labor. And you can see what a normal fetal heart tracing looks like. So that outline in black is the range of a normal acceptable fetal heart rate. And so she was fine, and then I was in the emergency department, and I was called emergently, like stat, to the maternity ward. And I didn't even ask where to go. I knew exactly which patient it was, and I went into her room, and I saw this. Severe fetal bradycardia. So that heart rate was in the 50s. It was 1/3 of what it should be. And this question came to go or no go. And it was, in my mind, it was clear. She needed an operation. She needed a stat C-section because that baby needed to come out. And so we got to the OR okay. The nurses were fantastic. Like, they are very senior. They knew what to do. We got to the OR okay. And the second question came into mind because the staff surgeon was 20 minutes outside the hospital. And I'm nearing the end of my training. I've done more than a few C-sections in my time. And the second question was, do we wait for the staff surgeon? Do we wait 20 minutes that I don't think that this kid has, or do we just go? Go or no go? And we acted. We went. I had that kid out in 4 minutes, and that baby required extensive resuscitation and a few extra days in hospital. But that kid made it. And I debriefed with the staff surgeon afterwards, and he said, you did what you had to do. There was no waiting. But sometimes when you're looking at the most high intensity of situations, it all comes down to a simple question. Go or no go. And no matter how critical the situation, whether you are jumping out of a plane at 14,000 feet or whether you're deciding to operate, you always have a second to breathe and to make that decision. So the last thing I want to talk to you about today, I know this has come up a lot today in the panels, is diversity and inclusion. And in my time at the International Space University in Silicon Valley with the Citizen Scientist Astronaut Corps and in medicine, I've dealt with very international, intercultural, interdisciplinary teams. And what I've learned is that we need different perspectives. Because sometimes the best ideas and the best insights come from not our own discipline and not someone else's discipline, but the cross bridge between disciplines. Because we need to put my information with your information together and then figure out what light we can shed on the situation. And to do that, to be able to get more perspectives, we need to make environments more welcoming. We need to, all of us, stand up and not to say that we're welcoming. We actually need to practice it. So when I started Taekwondo, I was one of the only girls, and the only girls who continued with it, and one of the only female black belts for a long time. And that was just the culture. It was very male-dominated. It's not like that today. At the club I have today, my head instructor has created an environment that is very conducive to the point where there's been classes where it's been all female senior red and black belts. And these isn't just women, these are girls of age 7, 10, 14. And they do it because this is their place to thrive. And to give you an example, we were once doing a warm-up exercise that involved high-intensity or low-intensity resistance bands. And we had a senior black belt who was a member of an older generation and would constantly make jibes that weren't necessarily PC. And so one day he looked at, when we were doing this warm-up exercise, he looked at the resistance band and he said, "Oh, look, it's the girls' bands and the boys' bands." And my instructor, I still remember this. He looked him dead in the eye and he said, "No, it's the bands for the strong and the less strong." And then he picked up the less strong and started working out with it. And that's what I mean when we say we can talk about diversity and we can talk about inclusion, but until we practice these things, until we stand up for those who don't have that representation, we're not going to have the viewpoints we want. So why does it even matter though? Like, why do we need to fight for these workplaces? Because, like I've told you, in my experience, all these different disciplines and perspectives offer more to our team. They offer different perspectives, they offer experience, and they offer value to our team. And so I try like mad to stop saying the F word, feminism. To me, it's egregious, the idea that we would call the notion that we would give everyone equal opportunity or equal say, the idea that that needs a special movement, the idea that that needs a special term when we're spelling it and pronouncing it wrong, when we should be pronouncing it and spelling it common sense and human decency, that to me seems egregious. And we need to change our mindset and we need to change our conversation until we flip it on our head. And those who question that we should be giving everyone an equal say and an opportunity to thrive, because that makes our teams thrive and our companies thrive and our missions thrive, until they're in the periphery and they're in the minority. So we need to stop saying it feminism and we need to stop saying it common sense. And so we hear a lot about the Me Too movement. And I think it's really important because there's all of these stories, and for a lot of us, all of these memories coming out, and we're just unraveling the depth and the prevalence and the egregiousness of what's occurred through most of our careers. But I think that's just a start, because it's one question to uncover what has happened, but you can't uncover what has happened without making a promise to make things better. And that's why I don't think we should be uttering the phrase Me Too without saying, not on my watch. Something bad happens in front of you and you don't agree with it, you say, not on my watch. Because the question is, maybe we've survived, maybe we think we're strong, but what about those who come after us? They shouldn't have to deal with it. And if we can stop it by a simple word or an action, then it's our duty to do so, to make things better for those who come after us. So you can say me too, but you have to say not on my watch. So we talked a lot about a variety of things here today. We've talked about success, we've talked about failure, we've talked about character, resilience, and we've talked about diversity and inclusion. And maybe a lot of this will dissolve in your minds, but maybe you want to remember some of it. The takeaway is that whatever we do in life, it's an ongoing process. It's a journey. It's not either or. You don't fail once and fail for life. You're not afraid once and you are afraid for life. You don't succeed once and then believe your own hype for the rest of your life. It's an ongoing journey to reach the next level, to push your limits. And even pushing your limits is a stepwise journey. And my favorite quote about this is, success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to go on that counts. And so I urge all of you to find your own journeys and your own challenges and to keep pushing your own boundaries. Thank you so much. You've got this.